What is an oligarchy? What is authoritarianism? What kind of government system are we living under? Is it as democratic as we think, or are there hidden forces at play? Around the world, many nations are shaped by systems that centralize power, from oligarchies controlled by the wealthy few to authoritarian regimes run by unchecked leaders. What do these systems mean for the average person, and how have they influenced history and our modern world? Let's dive deep into these concepts, exploring definitions, historical examples, and their modern implications. At its core, an oligarchy is a form of governance where power is concentrated in the hands of a small, elite group. This group, often wealthy or highly influential, controls important decisions that shape a country's policies and future. Instead of a government that serves the broader population, an oligarchy prioritizes maintaining the privileges and power of its elites. In these systems, the gap between the ruling elite and ordinary citizens often widens, leading to inequalities that can endure for generations. Oligarchies are not just relics of the past. They remain a powerful force in today's world. But to understand how they function, let's first look back at history, where we can see oligarchies operating in a pretense of fairness, while wealth and influence shape decision-making. One of the starkest examples of oligarchy in history is the United States during the so-called Gilded Age of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This era was dominated by the robber barons, industrialists who controlled key industries like oil, railroads, and steel. Figures like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie amassed staggering wealth while often monopolizing their respective sectors. At first glance, they symbolized success and enterprise, but beneath the surface, they concentrated political and economic power to the detriment of ordinary Americans. During this era, governments were heavily influenced by these industrial magnates who wielded their riches to sway elections, draft laws that served their interests, and crush labor movements. Ordinary citizens had little say in the direction their country was heading, as policies often benefited only a select elite. This oligarchic system widened inequalities and raised widespread public dissent. Even in today's America, some argue that similar dynamics exist, where billionaires and corporations have outsized influence on policymaking. Fast forward to the present, and we see an oligarchy flourishing in nations like Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a select group of businessmen, often called oligarchs, acquired massive wealth by controlling the country's key industries, from energy to media. This concentration of wealth has led to a tightly controlled political system. These oligarchs remain closely tied to President Vladimir Putin, whose leadership reflects an intertwining of state power and private interests. For instance, decisions about energy policies or international relations often align with the profits of these elites. In Russia, the power and privilege of a few continue to shape the future of millions. The common thread between historical and modern oligarchies is clear. The ruling elite consolidates power, while public influence remains sidelined. In contrast to oligarchy, where power is shared within a small group, authoritarianism centers all authority in the hands of a single ruler or regime. Unlike democracies, where systems of checks and balances keep leaders accountable, authoritarian regimes sideline these safeguards. The will of the leader reigns supreme, and dissent is often met with harsh repression. Key hallmarks of authoritarianism include censorship, propaganda, restrictions on individual freedoms, and the use of fear to maintain control. In these systems, citizens are expected to comply without question, and any resistance faces severe consequences. Let's look at some examples of modern authoritarian regimes and their lasting impact. One of the clearest examples of modern authoritarianism is China. Under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, China maintains a regime of strict control over its population. This control extends to how people think, communicate, and behave in daily life. Take the social credit system, for instance. This digital monitoring initiative assigns citizens a score based on their behavior, rewarding compliance and punishing dissent. Paired with extensive surveillance networks, such measures restrict freedoms while ensuring loyalty to the state. Protests against government policies are silenced, and the flow of information is tightly controlled, cementing the state's grip on power. In Saudi Arabia, power rests firmly with the royal family. The regime uses its control over oil wealth and religious authority to maintain power in an authoritarian system. Public criticism of the government is rare because of heavy crackdowns on free speech and human rights activism. Though some modern reforms have occurred, authoritarian traits remain dominant. Women, for example, have gained more freedoms in recent years, but the ultimate authority still lies with the state, leaving many personal freedoms restricted. While oligarchy and authoritarianism differ in governance style, they often interconnect. In several cases, countries may start as oligarchies but slide into authoritarian rule as a single leader consolidates control. Both systems share a common thread, the concentration of power, whether in the hands of a few or one supreme leader. This transition can be fluid. For instance, a wealthy oligarch might rise to power and use their resources to suppress opposition, edging toward authoritarianism. But what happens when these dynamics surface in countries presumed to be democratic? One of the most debated examples of this phenomenon is Donald Trump's presidency in the United States. His rise highlighted deep contradictions in the American political system. Trump's rallies became more than campaign events. They represented fierce loyalty from his supporters, but also drew criticism for polarizing the nation. Under his tenure, critics argued that democratic institutions were under strain. There were accusations of bending legal norms, pressuring judicial institutions, and creating an atmosphere where dissenting voices were labeled enemies. For some, Trump's rhetoric and political strategy bordered on authoritarian tendencies, raising questions about the health of democracy in the United States. More concerningly, Trump's rise showcased how systems with wealth disparities could nurture oligarchic traits, with power consolidating not just politically but financially. This interplay between oligarchy and authoritarianism becomes even more alarming when looked at through the lens of weakening democratic principles worldwide. The shift toward oligarchy and authoritarianism doesn't always happen overnight. More often, the signs are subtle, creeping into our institutions before we realize it. Here are some warning signals that democratic systems might be facing threats. A growing influence of wealth in political decision-making. Erosion of judicial independence or checks and balances. Suppression or control of a free press. Increased tolerance of autocratic behavior from political leaders. As citizens, recognizing these patterns is crucial. Democracies are not immune to sliding into systems that concentrate power in harmful ways. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such forces, but history shows that citizens have the ability to make their voices heard. Democratic systems thrive on engagement, from voting in elections to participating in protests and advocating for accountability. Transparency and vigilance are the antidotes to creeping oligarchic or authoritarian tendencies. As the video wraps up, we leave you with this question. Are democratic nations edging closer to oligarchy or authoritarianism? The question isn't theoretical. It's one that affects our freedoms, opportunities, and futures. As images of protests, Trump rallies, and public unrest flash across the screen, remember that the power to shape society doesn't rest solely with governments. It rests with you. Civic engagement, awareness, and action are the tools we must wield to safeguard democracy. Don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content. Let's keep engaging with the big questions that define our world. Together, we can dig deeper and shine a light on the systems that shape our lives. And remember, down with the oligarchy, eat the rich.